So this is Katie Green, or Catherine Green as it looks on official documents, and this is my presentation introducing beginners to 3D level design. So these are techniques for teaching total beginners, and really the entire process of creating this presentation and working on my own game design pedagogy has really worked with the problem of game design is so new that we don't really have a concrete canon that we can use to teach game design. So compared to, for example, teaching a drawing course, teaching game design is very different in the sense of there are less resources to find, and the resources that you do find typically have less authority simply because like I said, we haven't really developed a solid or coherent canon. There are a lot of voices talking about game design and the different methods that we should use to teach people game design, to create compelling games, and so on and so forth. So when new students typically come into my classes, and perhaps any class, but I am using my own courses as an example, they typically bring with them some very lofty, but also very concrete goals. So we can see some of the examples here: Red Dead Redemption 2, Cyberpunk 2077, the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So these are very large, very complex games with many, many angles. And this is often what students want to make. These are the types of experiences they're inspired by. These are the types of companies that they want to work for. So helping students understand game design better and get closer to reaching these goals is something that's very important for us as teachers. So here are some examples from my class, and as we can see, they're very different from our lofty goals over here. They're also very purple, sort of a melancholy feel. So I think this is so in discussing this issue, without any kind of concrete game design pedagogy to go with, and with these types of rapidly evolving games that are constantly using the newest technology, how do we reach this goal, right? So I actually think that one of the best ways to help your students create better games in the scramble to create games, I think it's this: showing examples of actual student projects. So these are all from my courses, and I think that gathering up and recording all of the games from your classes, yes, including even the duds, the ones that don't really turn out that well, you want to have both, because what we want are some good examples that are actually useful scaffolding for the students in the class, giving them a more realistic idea of what type of games they can make, what type of aesthetic design choices they might be making, and the types of output they're actually going to have with the skills that they are learning. So this doesn't just mean lower expectations. That's not what I mean here. You actually need to illustrate these expectations so that students know, okay, maybe I want to make a game like Breath of the Wild, but the reality is that I'm probably going to make a much smaller scale project in this class. So, there are a lot of reasons for why this happens. So the most obvious one is that AAA games involve tons of money and a lot of human labor. So if you look at these games and you compare them to my student games, you can see the difference. So my student games typically, sometimes they have no budget. Occasionally, the students can get some small grants to buy some assets to help them. The teams range in size from about 4 to 10 people. The games typically release on itch.io, and they're in development for the longest is about 2 years, and I want to have my students start developing games for longer, quite frankly. But if you compare them, you can clearly see why such a gulf exists between the student games and many of the goals that they bring with them. So you want to give students realistic examples here that they're conceivable for the students. So examples are really important, and if you don't have examples from your own institution, go ahead and get them from other institutions. So When I first started teaching at CSUMB, so that's where I currently teach, is California State University of Monterey Bay. When I first started developing my pedagogy there, I was writing a lot of courses from scratch, courses like game design. So I had 2 game design courses, character design, character animation, and environment design and level design. So quite a lot of courses and not a lot of examples to draw from. So I've been working at CSUMB for about 6 years now, and I'm starting into my second tenured year at CSUMB. So developing those classes was really the crash course for me towards that tenure, and also towards developing a more robust pedagogy for introducing games and encountering these problems directly where student games are concerned and where the issue of working with beginning students are concerned. So a lot of the students in my courses are taking it as an elective as well. They may be from other disciplines. They may not intend to be, obviously the capstone projects do, but a lot of my elective students, they don't intend to be game designers. And for those students, part of my goal is to just, sort of expand their ideas of ways that they can make art and the tools that they have the capability of using. So we don't want to encounter quite an off-putting situation, right? So I teach Maya. The main programs I teach are like Adobe Suite, Maya, and Unity. So here I've got Maya just because Maya is kind of infamous for its many menus and having a lot of confusing, somewhat esoteric workflows, especially for artists. So students enter into the class. They get to see the games that they could make and the conditions under which those different games were made, the games they want to make and the games they could make. And then they immediately, they immediately encounter all of this abstract information in Maya. All of this brand new vocabulary, vertex, edge, face, mesh, UV map, normal map, surfaces, what does any of this mean, right? So many of you guys may already know that teaching vocabulary through quizzes, rote memorization, is not necessarily the best way to do it. So I can give my students I can make them memorize the definition of a vertex in an abstract sense and force them to regurgitate that onto a quiz, but that's not actually helping them use the program, which is the main thing we're interested in at our program. We want students to actually be able to utilize the tools inside of the software to get a particular outcome that is the most professional outcome that they can come up with, or the most creative outcome, depending on that student's particular goals for themselves. So before we jump into more of the nitty-gritty of tools and techniques here, when we talk about game design, we're always talking about visual and interaction design. So I always blend my approach to both the affective and the effective quality of a game. Because it's not just, we know as game developers, at least, subconsciously after we work with games, the game itself, and this is according to the Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics frameworks from Robin Hunicke and et al., we can see that the game itself is taking place in a place and time and as a shared experience among people and the machine kind of as the focal point. So it's just to establish that when I talk about visual art, I'm not talking about it in a static sense ever. I'm talking about it in a human-computer interaction design sense, a UI, UX design sense, or, a game design sense, where the program that I teach at is called communication design because it's all about communicating with whoever is engaging with your creation or your product. So this is just an important thing to get out of the way when we're talking about games. And it's also part of why game design can be such a difficult discipline to teach, because you have a lot of conceptual pressure and a lot of technical pressure using these programs like Maya. So here are just some of the demands that for example, environment design students might be, or game design 1 students might be required to engage with in order to create a decent game. So we've got 2D composition skills, the realm of drawing and painting, rule of thirds, etc. We've got 3D visualization, spatial mapping ability, and sculpting ability. And then we have interaction design skills. So that's that, a little bit of psychology, understanding affordances. So how does the shape of my thing or the composition of my game, the placement of my lights, the placement of color, right? The scale of my 3D objects, all of those things are interacting together to create this holistic experience of the game. So I'm a 3D artist, and these are the tasks, right? I'm being given a game design task, a creative game design task, or a technical game design task, and there's quite a lot to consider. Because while you can create a nice skybox without understanding anything about human-computer interaction, if you're in school to study game design, it is certainly my responsibility as a teacher to familiarize you with the conceptual ideas that are behind the games you're going to make. I firmly believe that you'll be a much better level designer, even if you're just the one sculpting the level itself. You're not the one creating the block mesh. You're creating really hyper-detailed guns or rocks or something for the level. I firmly believe that having a conceptual basis and background for understanding video games helps you make better art for those games. That is, better works itself into an interactive product. So game design has often been approached using techniques pulled straight from other disciplines. If you've tried to teach or study game design, you're very familiar with this. Film, analog games, board games, games that use dice, games that are outside, football, right? There's all kinds of other disciplines that we're drawing on because we don't have that consistent canon. So video games, not games in general, and not media in general, or even, screens, the video games are super new creative media. So how do we even get started here, right? So I've certainly made attempts to reinvent the wheel myself. I've seen a lot of attempts to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, what should we focus on? Ludology versus narratology. What are games actually good at? What are the value of games? Like, all these conversations that we have academically about games and about the games as an industry and games as a creative product, like, where do we start, right? There's all these conversations, but like I said, no consistent canon or pedagogy. So instead of reinventing the wheel, let's borrow and borrow and borrow and learn as much as we can from those other mediums and also from the outside world. So that's where we're going to start here. Let's be interdisciplinary. It's very easy to want to reject, for example, philosophies of film when things like Roger Ebert, famous film critic, states quite plainly that games can never be art, right? So that immediately kind of, if you want to be tribalistic about it, right, we could just completely reject all of that stuff because we don't need it. We don't need film. We're games. Games are good at procedural things, not telling stories, right? So all those conversations the place I ended up was we should be borrowing because you can pick and choose the pieces that you like to teach, to help illuminate concepts, to apply it in your own work. So to clarify teaching, I know the pictures, I'll explain it. So I want to talk about art making in a medium first manner. So you've got our tools, for example, our chopsticks, and then we've got our techniques. So you have a tool and a correct way to apply it. So this is another example, a hammer. So the hammer is a tool. It has a couple, it has its own type of affordances, its own type of use. But then we have a technique, or in this case, right, the best practice for using the tool for some kind of affect or effect, right? So there's a right and a wrong way to use a hammer to get straight nails that actually hold your house together, right? So I could use a hammer I could make a sculpture out of hammers. I don't need to use the hammer for what it's intended for, right? But we practice as artists, we use tools to practice our techniques so that we get better and better at achieving a certain outcome. So whether that outcome is eating food without dropping it on yourself or building a house that doesn't fall over, we have to figure out how to use the tool first and apply those techniques before we can get started. So let's go backwards here. So let's move away from these generic examples into more of a game design example that's using the media that I'm actually teaching in the course. And you're probably using similar types of softwares in your class. So an example here is 3-point lighting. So 3-point lighting is, I most commonly teach this technique in character design and character animation, but it does pop up in games in general, and students find themselves creating cutscene type of material, and they need to learn these kind of cinematic basics to even get a kind of three-dimensional cutscene off of the ground like this with things like 3-point lighting. So 3-point lighting is a technique that is borrowed from portrait photography and TV and movies and film as well. So we use at least 3 lights. They are different shapes, different intensities, and they are set at different angles to the subject. The intent of this technique is to flatter the subject and separate them from the background. So this is a very basic problem that anybody who's shooting a character against a background in a real or a simulated 3D space, this is a problem that needs to be solved, right? So we use the technique of 3-point lighting to solve the issue of we want to flatter our subject and we want to separate them from the background. So 3-point lighting is a technique we could use to achieve that. And the tool we use to do this, so the technique is always going to be the same no matter what context we apply it in. Whether we're applying this in the context of a live action movie shoot or a 3-dimensional animation that's being made for kids, or a 3D animation cutscene inside of a pre-rendered cutscene inside of a game. They all have the same technique that they're using, and that's this basic idea of 3-point lighting as a way to flatter the subject and separate them from the background. Obviously, we don't have to use this type of standardized lighting, but it immediately gets us closer to those quote-unquote professional-looking results. So the literal tools that we use to apply techniques are different in each case. So if we're actually in a studio here, we have got our 3-point lights. So we have at least 3 of them. So we actually have to use lights. We have to use some kind of backdrop or background. This is in a studio, not shooting on any kind of, this is shooting on a set. But when we're in Unity or Maya or Blender or Unreal or some type of a space that is simulating light, that's a lot harder to know what we're supposed to do because we've lost our physicality and our focal point in the real life. So if anybody had kids who are trying to do virtual school, like younger kids, I feel like it's especially, this is an enhanced effect if kids are younger. People need to touch, taste, feel things to really learn. The screen has such a flattening effect, and when you're working in a simulated space where all you have is like a keyboard and a mouse or maybe a touch screen, it really reduces the ability of you people, whether you want to call them users, creators, humans, whatever, it reduces the ability of the person using the computer to actually understand what the technique is and to apply it with best practices. So while it's awesome to have these simulations of space that allow us to be our very own film director and cinematographer who has control over all these different parts, and we don't have to haul heavy lights that are, they're really hot and they make the actor or the actress really uncomfortable to sit under them. It's all vanished. We have none of those troublesome things to deal with. And I feel like it creates a situation where it's much easier for the student to blink and say they know what they're talking about, but they actually do not understand the technique and they do not understand their tool and they do not apply it correctly. So one of the things with my 3-point lighting, the first time I did my 3-point lighting lesson, students use 3 directional lights. So if you've lit scenes in game engines, you or animated films, you know that is not, that's like a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. It's going to probably create a severely oversaturated scene, and the directional lights are simulating the sun, not like any kind of studio light that's more like a spotlight or an area light or even a covered point light, right? So that, I think, really shows, just because you teach students about the 3-point lighting technique, you need to do more to illuminate the concept, right? And I showed them how to do this without, we don't want to always use 3-directional lights, right? So showing an example of you setting up this scene correctly with the right kind of lights is really going to help. So getting your own techniques down is obviously something that's really, really important here. So lights, right? They're different if they're in real space. And obviously, it's really helpful if you want to teach 3-point lights, and I think it's just, in the virtual space, a directional light is a light. It's aimed a certain place. The nuances and the kind of qualitative differences of the directional lights are a lot less obvious than these lights over here. The actual key fill and backlight have different qualities. You can see that they physically have different qualities than these lights, which are all totally metaphorical and might have different icons, and they do have different qualities as scripted for by in whatever game engine or renderer you're using. But it's a lot harder to come into contact with these nuances and understand what 3-point lighting is even really for. So there's a lot more in the notes if you want to follow me deeper into this rabbit hole with discussing focal points, and this gets into conversations about touch and aura and where does the art reside, right? And I'm not concerned about the computer erasing the artistic value of games. Obviously not. I wouldn't be a games professor, but I am very much concerned with my students' lack of understanding because of the metaphorical and simulationist nature of programs like Unity and Maya that have lost their physical focal points. So what we want to do is use a variety of lenses to introduce level design. So I'm going to run us through a very particular example and then look at some general ones, but I only have 10 minutes, so let's go. So here's an example from game design, Spotlight Cookie. So a student quite delightfully turned this in for my Spotlight Cookie assignment. So once again, learning from our failures, although I do think this student was being a bit of a smart ass because I had mentioned the difficulty of understanding the vocab word cookie and how silly it is. So I do think this is an example of a student being more clever than anything else, even though they didn't understand how to apply a Spotlight Cookie. So nice. They were paying attention in class, but they didn't ultimately get the memo on Spotlight Cookies. I'm trying to think if the student ever employed a Spotlight Cookie in their scene. I think they may have in the end, but it wasn't really that important for their scene either. And that's the thing that happens with techniques. Some students care more about certain techniques than others if you allow them to have any variability in their visual style. So one way to do this could just be really restrict what you're letting your students do, but that's certainly not what I would want an art class to be like. So what do you mean cookie, and what does a cookie have to do with a light? So typically when you're just working in a program, it's not clear. So let's take a quick look at Unity's definition. I don't want to pick on Unity too much because I looked at Unreal. It's bad in different ways, sort of better in other ways. So we have a very, very generic example of what a cookie does, but it doesn't connect to the real world at all. It just says, create a shadow with specific shape or color, which changes with the appearance and intensity of the light. Cookies are an efficient way of simulating complex lighting effects with minimal or no runtime and performance impact. So language very particular to game designers, because the fact that it doesn't hurt performance is going to be something that's very relevant, right, to game designers. So that's well and good, but it's not helping beginners really at all, who may not even be at the stage where they're worrying about optimization or runtime. They're just trying to create a very basic level inside of a game engine. So then we have a very high quality image that shows a very awesome result, but it doesn't really show what it's going to look like if you're an amateur and you perhaps slap a less optimized cookie on your light. I think it's important to not always just show So this is sort of the same as when you show your students examples of good game design or good level design, you want to use professional examples like Red Dead Redemption 2, right? That's big industry game. Everyone's familiar with it. I like to use games like that just because students can relate to it. It's super recognizable. But you also have to have those, examples from class or more quote unquote indie examples or unorthodox examples that they can draw from. So this is just our highly polished example. And then finally, we have this extra definition of cookies down here, further confusing the vocabulary term. So to clarify this, we have got a couple of steps. We have to figure out what the tool is, how the tool is used, why it was invented, who created it, and what they created it for. So to start, we need to define it. So define the tool. A tool is a spotlight cookie. The technique is using the cookie, the spotlight cookie, to create light diffusion and patterns on the ground. So I use the term light diffusion. I don't talk about optimization because I'm talking in a conceptual way. So create light diffusion and patterns on the ground for visual storytelling, immersion, aesthetics, etc. And then after I define this for myself, right, I know how to use a spotlight cookie or 3-point lighting correct, which is important. And don't necessarily assume you know how to do these things. It's good to, being a teacher, you're constantly getting back in touch with the basics, which I actually think is cool. So then let's get some history. So here's our history. So really, a cookie is just a type of shadow play. And the term itself is a Hollywood term from the 50s, invented by all of the sort of the boys club that was running Hollywood back in the day. So as it turns out, they actually had quite a lot of words for their different lights. So many that it seems quite excessive to a digital creator now who just pretty much says alpha or mask to mean cookie. In a sense, a lot of this came from sort of wondering myself, what the hell cookie? Like, why is that the term for an alpha that you put over a spotlight, right? And the reason is, of course, this muddled history. And I got this history from Painting with Light by John Alton. So this book is really interesting in just if you like to know the history of film. And it's one that's often assigned to cinematographers. So cinematographers, when you're starting as a beginning student, you might encounter this book. It's a very common book to encounter in like film school and people who are, painting with light. And I do think that the way that the book talks about light and the examples that it uses and all of the strange esoteric terms that they used for each individual light, which they were physically carrying around, so maybe that's why they gave them so many names. So here are some examples from the book. Some historical cookies. So they're actually more than, there are many things in the book you could describe as a cookie for Unity's purposes, but they had other names such as Gobo and even more that were very, very silly. So I think history can be engaging just because it's interesting, right? They had really silly terms. The sort of a lot of their goals that they talk about in this book might seem a little archaic to us as well, but I think it is a very useful thing. So we show all this lingo, then we show a modern example to better clarify the concept. Then we show an example inside of the game engine. So we're showing it applied. I also show here the spotlight cookie is not really correctly applied to this camera. It's copied everywhere, right? So we don't want that. And then we have a very stereotyped example over here. So I like to use these more stereotyped or even kind of examples of a somewhat misapplied cookie, and you do want to specify that, right? Just so students can know how to get started. What does it look like even when you have a misapplied cookie? Because I think sometimes students misapply their cookie, it looks like this, and they don't really even realize what they're working with because it doesn't resemble the examples they've been shown. So I think that's why this is important to show. So finally, I show an example of using an alpha channel in Photoshop to create a cookie. So we could also just use black and white. So I actually show the environment inside of the primary software or the middleware software. So we show where cookies came from and who invented them, which has some implications for the biases behind some of these processes. And then we introduce the cookie itself actually being utilized. And if you can use examples from your own project or student projects, I actually think that's better than generic Google examples, but there's nothing wrong with a generic Google now and again when you need to find examples. So to further elaborate, and I'm running out of time here, but to further elaborate, here's an overview of some frameworks, and you can review these later on your own if you find this to be an interesting way to approach your classes. And this is kind of like introductory lectures, ways to illuminate particular concepts that you're focused on in your classes, such as the Spotlight Cookie lesson. So these lenses that I've been using, and they're honestly kind of in order of discovery, I think, is film and cinematography, architecture, theater and set design, and then finally theme park design. And there are many more of these. I think you could use, psychology, just all kinds of different product designs. The cool thing about the lenses is that you can come up with your own based on your own experience and your own interests, and students can do the same. I think it's very important to provide people many avenues into whatever you're teaching so that you're not excluding people who may find themselves overwhelmed or alienated by the terms you're using, or by the fact that they're completely lost. So here they are. We're going to rush through them. Film and cinematography. So some of the ways that you can use this lens are thinking about, directing, provoking, capturing, setting up a stage, using a lens. But film is obviously very limited with respect to games. It's not interactive. You just sit there and watch a film, you play a game, right? But film is often very familiar to 2D design students, and we all watch movies as well. Architecture, place, planning, being a constructor, creating plans, flat plans before you finally actually construct it, right? Thinking about cities or monuments and places. So I use some of these, for example, a pattern language, because I'm not concerned with having my buildings stand up. My mountain might, it doesn't need to be physically sound. So we're not concerned with that element of architecture in so much as we are the, philosophical or conceptual ideas of how does architecture manipulate people's behavior. Finally, I have theater and set design, and then theme park design. I wish I could go into these more, but I'm definitely out of time. I have 30 seconds. So my last note, please go outside and encourage your students to as well. You're going to hear this from anyone who draws. You need to learn to see before you can really start creating anything. So please engage with reality. Pay attention to how spaces are affecting you. Ask your students to keep diaries, to sketch, to constantly be engaged with the world around them so that they can create better, more interesting games and really understand the tools that they're working with and where they come from. So thank you.